Hello, today I would like to talk about a little history of Mendota, Illinois, early history. A while back ago I read an article dated June 1st, 1906 about the first settlers here, and one of the guys was Samuel Hastings. And here's a picture of him here on my laptop here. I don't know if you can see him. But that's Samuel Hastings, and what he wrote for the paper had asked him to write an account of when he first came to Mendota, so bear with me here as I zoom in on this and read it. There's a couple important points in here about the Illinois Central Railroad coming up here and not seeing any other railroad, which was the Chicago and Aurora Railroad, which was later to become the CB&Q, and about building the first foundation for the Illinois Central Freight House, which was the first structure in Mendota. But anyway, let me read through this. I think you'll get some things out of this. It's called An Early Settler. Experience of Samuel Hastings, his trip west, why he settled in Mendota, the first citizens, and date of arrival, the early history of Mendota. Now, this article goes into two different papers, and it's very lengthy, but I'm just going to focus on a couple things here. But if you're interested in reading the whole newspaper article, we do have that available. And you'll have to come to the Railroad Museum, particularly the 909 building, and check it out. Anyway, here we go. Written expressly for the Sun Bulletin. What is more interesting than reading of what happened in Mendota in its youthful days? To many it will be news, and again to others it will only turn back the pages of their life book and renew the dim epochs of early days. Mr. Samuel Hastings is one of the first men who came to Mendota. At our request, he has written a paper telling of his life and intermingling the story with important happenings, many of which will be news to his own chums in former days. Really, this article is worthy of being saved for future generations to read. The following is a likeness of this gentleman, which was taken several years ago, and I showed you his picture. Anyway, let's read the first page, which has some very important information. Samuel Hastings was born in Harrison County, Ohio. Early in September 1853, as railroads were then just completed to Zanesville, Ohio, and through to Chicago, Illinois. In the West, my father, John Parrish, and myself, then citizens of Ohio, had arranged to come west, Peru, Illinois being our objective. We left home, arriving at Zanesville by stagecoach 50 miles west. After a day and night ride, we arrived in Chicago, Illinois. In the afternoon, we boarded the Rock Island train for Peru, and in due time arrived at LaSalle, and was told the train went no further. On the next morning, we took an Illinois Central construction train to the junction, which would later be Mendota. On landing here, we discovered no CB&Q railroad, for it had not got here yet. He is talking about this in 1906, and it was CB&Q at that time. But originally it was the Chicago and Aurora, and later on in the article he does mention the Chicago and Aurora was that railroad. On landing here, we discovered no CB&Q railroad, for it had not got here yet. No houses, and no one here except D.D. Giles, occupying a little one-story frame building, 20 by 30 feet, carrying some dry goods and groceries, and in one corner a pigeonhole box for mail matter. No post office yet. Okay, bear with me here as I go to the next page here. Okay. Okay, we're going to be talking about the stakes that Timothy B. Blackstone laid out for the town when he platted Mendota at that time. We looked around at the stakes for the streets and lots as best we could, for then there was no obstruction in the way but prairie grass 16 to 20 inches high. We got back to Main Street, what is now Fisher's Block, and came to a little new built structure about 10 by 15 feet. This seemed to be well filled with eatables, a cook stove with dishes, pots and pans, a middle-aged man, the sole cook and bottle washer of the institution. It being about the noon hour, we were constrained to partake of his hotel viands or go without. The proprietor gave us his name as Thomas Chick from the state of Maine, just starting in business, a lone pioneer of advanced emigration. Quite a number will remember him. We remained until 5 p.m., then rode to Homer, now Troy Grove, by wagons, returning there at the end of each day after delivering 2 loads of stone per day to build the foundation for the first railroad building at the junction. Then that was the only name given to the present Mendota. So Mendota was called the Junction at first, and the Illinois Central ended up naming Mendota. And let's see if there's anything else in here. So far we've covered 2 points, actually 3. The Illinois Central was first, meeting the Chicago and Aurora, and let me explain a little bit about that, or actually this article will, but in a nutshell, the Chicago and Aurora stopped at Mendota, and that's as far west as the railroad went. The Central Military Track Railroad, which would come from Galesburg, didn't arrive till a few years later. So the only way to go west was to get on an Illinois Central train once you hit Mendota on the Chicago and Aurora. The timetables tell this in the early days, in the 1850s. And then you had to go south on the Illinois Central and then get on the Rock Island at LaSalle and go west. So let's scoot ahead here. Okay. After 6 or 7 days stay in the vicinity, coming up in the morning and back to Homer in the evening, we planned to make a trip farther west, following as near as possible the state outline of what was then known as the Military Track Railroad from the junction to Galesburg. The eastern end, after its completion to the junction, was known as the Chicago and Aurora Railroad. For some months, passengers coming this way from Chicago were transferred to the Illinois Central, going farther southwest by the Rock Island, which was several months in advance of the present CB&Q road in extending its line. We left Homer with 2 horses and a covered spring wagon equipped with night covering, if it became necessary to pass the night upon the prairie. I will here state that a few days before leaving, John Parrish had left us and gone to Bloomington, Illinois, where he had friends. We saw no more of him until we returned to Ohio. Anyway, that's as far as I wanted to go. I wanted to explain that the railroad only went so far, the Chicago and Aurora. In the Illinois Central, I want to express that the Illinois Central work train that they took up from LaSalle, the line was just in, but I'm sure it was pretty rough, and maybe it wasn't completely ballasted, the track. Maybe it was just a work train going up, hauling supplies to extend the railroad and possibly hauling supplies like lumber to build the freight house, which it was a brick building, and hauling a brick too. And that's the first structure, brick structure built in Mendota, and it still stands, and I definitely recommend you to go in there and have a nice meal and look at the foundation when you're outside the building. And that foundation really was built by the same person I'm talking about in the paper, and a group of other men, Samuel Hastings, his father, and John Parrish. So there was a quarry in Troy Grove, which was first called Homer, where they would get the stone and bring them up. So there's a lot of history right in this little beginning of Mendota there, and I don't want to have that forgotten. So I don't think there's anything else I want to add to that which would add confusion or just too much information. But I really like the idea of going through these old newspapers and finding all this neat stuff, you know. Let's see, okay. I think there is one other thing that I want to add. Maybe not, just bear with me here. No, that's going to be it. So anyway, I hope you got something out of this video about the history, early history of Mendota. Number one, Samuel Hastings was one of the early settlers, and he did start a business in Mendota, wallpaper coverings. I see the advertisements, S. Hastings. And I also want to say that the stakes that were laid out for the town, that Timothy B. Blackstone, a surveyor, surveying engineer for the Illinois Central, laid out them stakes. And the center of where he laid out the town was where our steam engine is at, where the old REA building, the Railway Express Agency building, the bricks to the floor of that building still, some of them still exist, and it's just right there by the tender of the steam engine. So that's where Timothy B. Blackstone came and started laying everything out from there before the Illinois Central arrived. So he came up on a stagecoach from LaSalle in a horse and wagon, and brought his instruments of surveying, laid out the town, and then shortly thereafter, the Illinois Central started following that path and laying the tracks, and came up to Mendota, and Samuel Hastings found his way to, on the Rock Island, came to LaSalle, and then came north to Mendota, to the junction. It was called the junction at the time. And Mendota had 3 railroads that crossed paths. Mendota means crossing of the trails. So the crossing of the trails was going to be the Illinois Central and the Chicago and Aurora, and the Central Military Tract coming from Galesburg. They would meet later, a few years later, I think in 1856, that would become the CB&Q, and that was the junction. Even there's a sign up in the on display at the Milwaukee, at the, not Milwaukee station, but the our depot museum, and by the steam engine it says the junction 1 mile, junction 1 mile. That's on the old Milwaukee. That sign was exactly 1 mile south of the junction where these railroads crossed. There was 2 diamonds between 5th and 6th Street. So that's where everything crossed. And then there was a talk of a 4th railroad coming in 1905 to 1911. It was the Mendota and Ottawa Railroad. It never happened. It was graded, but that would have been the 4th railroad. But the Milwaukee was the final one, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, which tapped into the coal mines. So when they came, the Milwaukee came in 1904. They built the depot, and there was a row of houses there along 7th Avenue West, which was first called South Main Street. And those row of houses had to be moved excuse me, by the railroad, and so they bought the houses from the owners for, well, actually, technically, there was a tornado that came through also on July 17th, 1903, which wiped out a bunch of houses, killed 4 people, kind of on the north end of Mendota. So the Tornado Relief Committee was helping those people out, and the Milwaukee helped those people out by selling those houses really cheap. They bought up the houses from the owners, I believe, and then they sold the houses to those people that were in need of a home. And so what they did is measure the foundations, and then put new foundations up north, and then moved those houses. They were doing a lot of moving buildings back then in 1904. They moved not only those houses in 1904, they moved the Illinois Central Freight House, I believe the same year in 1904, and they also ended up moving a grain elevator about where Black Brothers is at now, because that used to be the old CB&Q engine house and turntable. That elevator was, the Dole elevator was in that area, and they had to move it across the CB&Q main over to the Milwaukee side track, the house track, which ran behind the Milwaukee Depot, which went straight north until it connected with the CB&Q. And that elevator is depicted at the Railroad Museum, not only in pictures, but on the model. So if you want a good idea of what Mendota looked like in its early days, you can go to the Railroad Museum and see the model, and just tons of pictures, tons of information now. So the other thing I want to say is that the Milwaukee, when they came to town, they laid the tracks, they tapped into the coal mines because there was a big coal shortage. There were coal problems in 1903, 1904. And the Illinois Central was hauling coal for the Milwaukee for a long time, for the Chicago-Milwaukee-St. Paul main line. This is before the Rochelle and Southern, where the Milwaukee line came through Mendota. And they needed to get the coal to the main line, so they took the coal from Southern Illinois, took it up to Freeport, and then over to Rockford, and then up to the main line in Janesville, Wisconsin. Well, then when 1903, 1904 rolled around, and the Illinois Central was like, hey, you know, we got our own coal problems, we got our own coal hauling, you know, you're going to have to take care of it yourselves. So the Milwaukee said, okay, fine, we're going to tap into the, we're going to create coal mines. You know, so they created a bunch of mines, Cherry being the furthest one north. I believe Standard, Mark, Cedar Point, Granville. I'm not sure about the Seatonville and Ladd mine, if they were in Spring Valley. I think Spring Valley was St. Paul mine. But there were a bunch of coal mines in the area. They got the coal, and tons of coal trains rolled past the depot and north. Until about 1928 to 1930, right in that area. I'm not 100% sure, but it was right around that time. And then the Illinois Central ended up, you know, the coal shortages were not a huge problem then. So the Illinois Central resumed bringing up coal cars for the Milwaukee, and they would bring them up from Southern Illinois and set them out on the Illinois Central tracks just south of where the depot's at now. The yard, 4-track yard, was just south of the Milwaukee Depot, which is now the Faber Depot. Make sure you check that out. A lot of history in there, some goodies, lots of goodies, and some antiques. So you want to go in there and take a trip back in time. And just south of that depot, and in front of the depot was 2 tracks, behind it was a track, and south of town about 3 blocks was a 4-track yard. That's where the Illinois Central set out their coal cars and other freight for the Milwaukee that they exchanged with. And the Milwaukee would hand off cars to the Illinois Central too. So anyway, Cole